welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Detective's World. I've been a detective for just over 10 years now, 3 of those spent working as a homicide investigator. In my career, I've met some outstanding cops, and I've worked with some guys who probably should have never worn a badge. But if there's one person who stands out from the rest, it's blue blood. I know what you're thinking. Blue blood sounds like something from a crime drama, right? Some romanticized, larger-than-life character. But that's not blue blood. The term blue blood gets tossed around a lot these days, mostly because of the TV show, but it's meant to describe a cop who was born for the job, not just someone who wears a uniform. And blue blood? He was that rare breed. He wasn't just a good cop, he was a natural. The first time I saw him in action, I thought he was the kind of guy who'd scare a confession out of someone just by looking at them. Cold, calculated, and yet somehow, completely detached. He wasn't egotistical, which was rare for a guy who could break a case wide open with the sheer force of his intellect. He was thorough. He didn't stop until every last possibility had been exhausted, until there was only one explanation left standing, and it was always the right one. But the thing I remember most about Blue Blood was his interrogation technique. I don't know if I'd call it a method, more like an art. It was a performance. Every question had weight, every pause held tension. You could watch the suspect unravel in front of him, like watching a fragile thread snap. The first time I saw it, I was in awe. It was just after Thanksgiving in 2001 when the call came in. A body had been found near Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, by a trail known as the White Rocks. Body was that of a 20-year-old girl, a student, whose father had reported her missing a few days earlier. According to the father, they had argued during their drive back from a family visit, and his daughter had demanded he let her out of the car. He did, afraid they'd crash if she kept yelling, and that was the last time he saw her alive. The father, understandably distressed, had tried calling her later, but her phone went straight to voicemail. After a few days of no contact, he filed a missing persons report. Then, 2 days later, the body was found. The girl was fully clothed, but her head was wrapped in a plastic bag, and the initial assumption was that she had been suffocated. But when the body was moved, they found that the bag was the only thing holding her skull together. Her skull had been smashed, as though struck with something heavy, like a dumbbell or a metal object. There was also something more disturbing: she wasn't wearing any underwear. The investigators immediately began canvassing the area. A local man with a criminal record, a history of indecent exposure and battery, was brought in for questioning. He had admitted to seeing the girl the night she disappeared. She had knocked on his door, saying someone was following her and asking to come inside. But she had changed her mind and ran off. It seemed like an open and shut case. The guy had priors, and he'd been in the area. But Blue Blood didn't buy it. Not completely. He kept coming back to one nagging question: why was the father and daughter in the area of White Rocks in the first place? I'll admit, I didn't understand what Blue Blood was getting at. The father's story checked out, at least on the surface. He was a regular traveler between Gettysburg and Mechanicsburg, so he knew the area. But Blue Blood wasn't so sure. He couldn't let go of the idea that there was Another reason they had ended up in that secluded part of the world, a reason that didn't add up. We started looking deeper into the father's life. We interviewed his ex-wife, the girl's biological mother. But she had been out of the picture for years, and no one seemed to know why. When we asked the father about it, he just shrugged it off. They hadn't spoken in years, he said, and he had no contact details for her. It was during one of those interviews that Blue Blood mentioned something casually. He referred to the girl's mother as her stepmother. That was the first time anyone had ever used that term. No one had even known that the girl wasn't the father's biological daughter. When the father married her mother, he had taken his wife's last name. And that, to Blue Blood, was more than just a quirky detail. It was a thread. I didn't understand it at first. Why did it matter that he'd taken his wife's last name? It was a personal choice, right? Maybe it was just a weird family dynamic. But Blue Blood wouldn't let it go. He kept saying there was something about that decision, about changing his name, that felt off. So, we dug deeper. We questioned the father's friends and relatives, and slowly, the pieces started falling into place. It turned out that the father's relationship with his stepdaughter had been odd. Possessive, even. The girl had started looking at colleges, preparing to leave home, and from what we could gather, her father was afraid of losing her. He didn't want her to grow up. He didn't want her to leave. It wasn't just a father's love, it was an unhealthy, controlling love. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about a murder. This was about control. This was about a man who couldn't stand the idea of losing the girl who wasn't even his own flesh and blood, a girl he had raised as his daughter, but in a way that was twisted and suffocating. Blue Blood kept pushing. He didn't show his hand, though. He was patient. He waited until we had the father in for a second round of questioning. When the father arrived for the interview, things started off just like all the others. Polite. Civil, he thanked us for the work we were doing, said he was just waiting for the killer to be caught. We went over his story again, repeating the same details about how he had tried calling his daughter and how he had made that strange detour. He said he had driven straight home after his stop near White Rocks. But something about his tone didn't sit right with Blue Blood. Blue Blood pressed him on the timing. He wasn't sure exactly how long he had stopped, the father said, but it was a lot longer than he'd originally stated. And that's when Blue Blood interrupted him, calling him a liar. There was a moment of stunned silence. The father looked furious. He demanded an explanation. Blue Blood, calm and collected, simply nodded toward the door and mentioned the father's attorney. The interview was suspended. But the damage had been done. The father was rattled. The real breakthrough came when Blue Blood shifted gears. He suddenly brought up the girl's romantic life. He started mentioning all the guys she had been involved with, throwing out names like Chad, Bryce, and Tommy. He claimed to have read through her AOL instant messenger conversations and implied that one of her lovers might have killed her. It was absurd. I knew Blue Blood had his methods, but this wasn't part of the case. There was no evidence of any romantic entanglements that could have led to her death. But there was something about the way Blue Blood said it. He was making the father squirm. And then it happened. The father's expression shifted. From anger to confusion, to a sudden, almost violent fury. He stood up, his fists clenched, and shouted, she wasn't seeing anyone. She was not seeing Anyone. His attorney jumped up, but it was too late. The dam had broken. Blue Blood didn't flinch. He pushed further. So, you know for sure she wasn't seeing anyone, Mr. Ross? The father's face turned crimson. That's right, the father growled. Blue Blood leaned in. You didn't let her see anyone, did you? You exercised complete control over her life, over everything she did. You were scared, weren't you? Scared of losing her. And that was it. The father's facade crumbled. He started shaking, his lips trembling. And then, in the heat of the moment, he spat out the words that would seal his fate. She was mine. She was always mine. And now, she'll be mine forever. The confession was chilling. It wasn't the confession we expected, but it was the truth. The girl's stepfather had killed her, not because of some random incident, but because his possessiveness had consumed him. He couldn't bear the idea of her becoming independent, of leaving him. The case didn't make as many headlines as it should have. 9/11 had already overshadowed everything. But it haunted. Burn Unit Story. The sun had barely risen on an unusually chilly Thanksgiving morning when I found myself trudging into the burn unit for another long shift. I was a nurse with years of experience, but working in the burn unit was a different beast entirely. The sharp smell of antiseptic and the sterile hum of machines filled the air as I stepped through the double doors. I braced myself for the intensity that awaited. Burn units were never quiet during the holidays. You might think holidays are meant for joy and family gatherings, but in our line of work, they often meant an uptick in tragedies. 4th of July was infamous for fireworks gone wrong, and Thanksgiving had its own brand of disasters. Cooking accidents, grease fires, and alcohol-fueled mishaps kept us on our toes. But nothing prepared me for the events of that day. Mid-morning, the commotion started. 2 patients were wheeled into the ICU, accompanied by police officers. The first was a man in his early 30s, his face, chest, and arms covered in severe burns. The second was a young woman, barely out of her 20s, her injuries even more horrifying. Both were in critical condition, and it was clear they had been through something catastrophic. I quickly learned the story. According to the officers, the man was a pimp, and the woman was one of his girls. They'd been part of a group attempting a makeshift Thanksgiving dinner. Details were murky, but somehow, the woman had caught fire. Instead of trying to save herself, she'd turned and embraced the man in what could only be described as a desperate act of vengeance. "If I'm going down, you're coming with me," was the phrase that echoed in my head as I pieced it together. We worked tirelessly on both patients. The woman had sustained extensive 2nd and 3rd-degree burns, and her inhalation injuries from toxic smoke sealed her grim fate. Despite our efforts, she coded later that night. I stood in the corner of the room as the attending called her time of death, a lump forming in my throat. Her last moments must have been a storm of pain and desperation, and it haunted me. The man, on the other hand, had a better prognosis. His burns were severe but not immediately life-threatening. He would live, though the scars would remain as a testament to his actions. As I changed his bandages the next day, he looked at me with eyes that made my skin crawl, cold, calculating, and utterly unrepentant. He was handcuffed to the bed under police guard, but even that didn't ease the sense of unease he radiated. Nights in the burn unit were always tense, but the incident that followed was something none of us could have anticipated. Around 3 a.m., the night shift crew heard screams coming from the man's room. Startled, they rushed to investigate, expecting an intruder or a medical emergency. What they found was chilling. The man was thrashing on the bed, his eyes wide open, screaming, "Get her off of me. She's here. She's going to kill me." His voice was hoarse and panicked, and he stared fixedly at a blank spot on the wall. No one else was in the room. They tried to calm him, but his terror only escalated until a doctor authorized sedation. Even as the medication took hold, he kept mumbling about her and how she was watching him. Word of the incident spread quickly among the staff. Theories abounded. Some thought it was a reaction to medication or trauma-induced hallucinations. Others whispered about the girl's spirit seeking vengeance. I wasn't one for superstition, but even I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that lingered after hearing the story. The next morning, the man was subdued. He barely spoke as I performed my rounds, and he flinched at every shadow that crossed his room. He seemed relieved when the officers arrived to transfer him to jail. I've seen many patients fight and scream to avoid leaving the hospital. But not this man. He thanked the officers like they were rescuing him from something unseen. I couldn't stop thinking about him after he was gone. His fear had been so visceral, so raw, that it left me questioning my own beliefs. Was it just his guilty conscience tormenting him? Or was there something more? Something that lingered in the air like the acrid smell of burned flesh? As the years passed, the events of that Thanksgiving remained vivid in my memory. It wasn't just the horror of the burns or the tragedy of the young woman's death. It was the questions it raised about justice, guilt, and the unseen forces that might shape our lives and deaths. Every Thanksgiving since, I've made a point to hug my family a little tighter, grateful for the peace and warmth that so many others never get to experience. The burn unit taught me many lessons, but that day taught me this: some scars run deeper than the skin, and some pains linger long after the flames have died. Thanksgiving Stalker Story. It was a cold November morning when Melissa found herself reflecting on the Thanksgivings that had changed her life forever. Two separate incidents, years apart, had left scars, some visible, others deeply embedded in her soul. Yet, despite it all, she sat at her desk, pen in hand, ready to put her story on paper. Maybe sharing it would help her heal, or perhaps it would serve as a warning to others. This was her journey. Melissa was only 13 years old when her world was first shaken. A bright and cheerful middle schooler, she loved math class, not for the equations but for the sense of accomplishment she felt when solving problems. But that year, something, or rather, someone, changed everything. His name was Eric, a boy in her grade who had developed an intense and unhealthy fixation on her. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Eric would blush whenever Melissa answered a question in class or nervously try to talk to her during lunch. She thought it was just a harmless crush. But soon, his behavior turned dark. Eric started waiting for her by her locker every morning, muttering strange, unsettling compliments as she passed. "Your hair smells so good," he'd whisper, leaning in too close. Melissa felt her stomach churn but tried to brush it off. He's just awkward, she thought. But it didn't stop there. Eric's obsession grew. He began following her between classes, and she realized he had memorized her schedule. He would find ways to sit near her at lunch or accidentally bump into her in the hallways. The worst was when he started leaving notes in her locker, detailed Graphic notes describing things no 13-year-old should ever read. Melissa was terrified. She reported it to her teachers, the school counselor, and even the vice principal. They sympathized but said their hands were tied. Eric hadn't technically done anything yet. The most they could do was switch her classes, hoping the separation would deter him. For a brief moment, it worked. But Eric wasn't easily dissuaded. He found her new schedule and resumed his stalking. Then, just before Thanksgiving, he approached her with a question that made her skin crawl. "Will you go out with me?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and something darker. Melissa was too scared to say anything other than a firm no. She walked away quickly, praying he would finally get the message. Instead, he escalated. Eric began following her after school, tracking her to her bus and even trying to find her address. One day, he cornered her by her locker and whispered a chilling threat. "I'm coming to your house on Thanksgiving. I'll bring a gun, and I'll kill your whole family." Melissa froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream but couldn't find her voice. That night, she told her parents everything. Her father, a former Marine, immediately called the police. When the police visited Eric's house, they found what they initially thought was a firearm. Thankfully, it turned out to be an airsoft gun, but the damage was done. Eric's intent was clear, and the principal finally took action. He was expelled and sent to a school for troubled youth. Melissa breathed a sigh of relief, but the incident left her shaken. It would take years before she could walk to her locker without glancing over her shoulder. 5 years later, Melissa was in high school, preparing to graduate and begin a new chapter of her life. She had managed to move past the trauma of her middle school years, or so she thought. But the universe had other plans. She met Jason during her junior year, and their relationship started innocently enough. Jason was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in her. For a while, Melissa thought she had finally found someone she could trust. But as their senior year progressed, Jason's behavior became increasingly possessive. When Melissa received her acceptance letter to a college in another state, she decided it was time to break up with Jason. They were heading in different directions, and she didn't see a future with him. Jason didn't take the news well. At first, he called her incessantly, begging her to reconsider. When she didn't answer, he showed up at her house, pleading with her parents to let him in. Melissa's father had to physically escort him off their property. But Jason didn't give up. He began showing up at her work, sitting in his car for hours just to watch her. He sent her flowers with cryptic messages like, "We're meant to be together," and left voicemails saying he couldn't live without her. Melissa blocked his number, but Jason always found another way to contact her. Thanksgiving weekend was the breaking point. Melissa had returned home from college to spend the holiday with her family. Late one night, while everyone was asleep, she heard a noise downstairs. She grabbed her phone and crept to the top of the stairs, her heart pounding. There, through the front window, she saw Jason trying to force his way in. She called 911, whispering her address to the dispatcher. Her father woke up and grabbed his hunting rifle, ready to defend his family. By the time the police arrived, Jason had fled, but the damage was done. Melissa knew she wasn't safe. The next day, Jason attacked her while she was walking downtown with a friend. He appeared out of nowhere, shouting accusations and blaming her for everything that had gone wrong in his life. Before she could react, he punched her, knocking her to the ground. Her Friend screamed, drawing the attention of bystanders who called the police. Jason was arrested and sentenced to a few months in jail. For Melissa, it was a bittersweet victory. She used the time to move an hour away, change her number, and rebuild her life. But the fear never truly left her. Years later, Melissa sat by the window of her apartment, sipping a cup of tea as she watched the snow fall. She had come a long way since those dark Thanksgivings. She had a job she loved, supportive friends, and a sense of independence she had fought hard to earn. But the scars of her past lingered. She carried a taser in her purse and always checked her surroundings when walking alone. She had taken self-defense classes and installed extra locks on her doors. Melissa refused to let fear control her life, but she also refused to be unprepared. Writing her story had been cathartic. It reminded her of how far she had come and how much strength she had gained. She hoped that by sharing her experiences, she could help others recognize the signs of unhealthy behavior and find the courage to seek help. As the clock struck midnight, Melissa set down her pen and closed her journal. She had turned her pain into purpose, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. Thanksgiving was no longer a reminder of what she had lost but a celebration of what she had overcome. Melissa's story is one of resilience, strength, and survival. It serves as a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and rebuild, even in the face of unimaginable fear. And while her past may always linger in the shadows, her future shines brightly, a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever felt trapped by their circumstances. Thanksgiving Trauma Story. The year was 2003, and Thanksgiving was fast approaching. The crisp November air carried the scent of burning firewood, and the anticipation of a family feast filled our house with a unique kind of energy. My family always celebrated Thanksgiving at our grandmother's sprawling old home nestled in a quiet suburb. It was the kind of house that seemed alive, creaking and groaning with the passage of time, holding within its walls decades of memories. I was 9 years old, the second eldest of 5 siblings, with an innate curiosity that often led me into trouble. This Thanksgiving was different from the start. My grandmother had recently undergone hip surgery, so the usual hustle and bustle of her preparing the feast was replaced by my mom and aunts taking charge of the kitchen. The aroma of turkey, pumpkin pie, and stuffing filled the air as we, the kids, were relegated to the task of entertaining ourselves in the cavernous house. My elder cousin Jake, a daring 14-year-old, decided we needed an adventure to pass the time. He suggested exploring the attic, a place forbidden to us for as long as I could remember. It was rumored to be filled with relics of my grandmother's past, treasures that spanned generations. The allure of the unknown was irresistible. We ascended the creaky staircase leading to the attic, our flashlights barely piercing the dense darkness. The attic was vast, with cobweb-covered trunks, dusty furniture, and an assortment of odds and ends scattered haphazardly. The air was heavy with the scent of mothballs and aged wood. As we sifted through old photo albums and vintage clothing, Jake unearthed a peculiar-looking chest. It was locked, but the lock seemed fragile, as though it had been weakened by time. Without hesitation, Jake produced a rusty screwdriver and pried it open. Inside, we found an assortment of trinkets, yellowed letters tied with ribbon, a cracked porcelain doll, and an ornate silver mirror. The mirror immediately caught my attention. Its surface was tarnished, but it held an ethereal quality, as though it had witnessed events long forgotten. When I peered into it, the reflection was strangely dim, as if the mirror was reluctant to show me the present. Jake teased me for being spooked, but there was something unsettling about it. Our exploration was cut short by the distant call of our mother summoning us to dinner. We hurriedly packed the items back into the chest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching us. That night, the Thanksgiving dinner was as lively as ever. The dining room was filled with the sound of laughter, clinking silverware, and the occasional outburst from the younger kids vying for attention. Yet, my mind kept wandering back to the attic and that peculiar mirror. As the evening progressed, a sudden commotion erupted from the kitchen. My youngest sister, Emily, had accidentally knocked over a gravy boat, spilling its steaming contents onto the floor. While the adults cleaned up the mess, I noticed something odd. Emily was staring at her reflection in the kitchen window, her expression blank. When I called her name, she snapped out of it, but her demeanor remained subdued for the rest of the evening. Later that night, unable to sleep, I decided to sneak back into the attic. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak of the floorboards. I carried a flashlight and tiptoed past the bedrooms, careful not to wake anyone. When I reached the attic, the mirror seemed to beckon me. As I approached, the air grew colder, and an inexplicable sense of dread washed over me. I stood before the mirror, its surface now inexplicably pristine, as though it had been polished. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something off. The eyes in the reflection didn't seem like mine. They were too intense, too aware. Suddenly, the image in the mirror shifted. I saw flashes of unfamiliar faces, places I'd never been, and events I couldn't comprehend. It was as though the mirror was showing me memories that weren't my own. Terrified, I backed away, tripping over an old trunk and falling to the floor. The noise must have startled someone because I heard footsteps ascending the stairs. It was Jake, his face pale as a ghost. "You saw it too, didn't you?" he whispered. He confessed that after dinner, he'd felt compelled to return to the attic. He'd looked into the mirror and experienced the same chilling visions. Together, we decided the mirror needed to be removed from the house. The next morning, while the adults were preoccupied with cleaning up from the feast, Jake and I carried the mirror out to the backyard. We debated what to do with it, ultimately deciding to bury it. Using a pair of shovels we found in the shed, we dug a deep hole near the old oak tree at the edge of the property. As we lowered the mirror into the ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Once the mirror was buried, an eerie calm settled over the house. Emily's odd behavior ceased, and the rest of the weekend passed without incident. Yet, Jake and I knew better than to dismiss what we'd experienced. We made a pact to never speak of the mirror again. Years later, long after my grandmother had passed and her house had been sold, I found myself revisiting that Thanksgiving in my thoughts. The memories had faded with time, but the unease lingered. One day, out of curiosity, I searched online for stories about haunted objects. To my shock, I came across an account of a mirror matching the description of the one we'd found. It was said to be cursed, capable of showing visions of the past, present, and future, but at a terrible cost. The story sent chills down my spine. Had we unwittingly unleashed something by disturbing the mirror? Or had we saved ourselves and our family by burying it? I'll never know for sure. But every Thanksgiving, as I sit down with my own family, I can't help but glance at the reflections in the windows and wonder if the past is truly behind us. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.